"You don't belong in a place like this." Those were the first words Jack Miller heard the moment he stepped through the iron gates of the Hayes estate, and they landed heavier than the morning sun pressing down on the quiet suburban street outside Austin, Texas. Jack stood still for a second, one hand resting on the strap of his worn tool bag, the other holding a folded work order that had already been half crumpled during his drive. He wasn't here to argue, and he wasn't here to impress anyone. He was here to fix a broken wooden fence panel that had been reported as unstable after last night's windstorm rolled through the area. Simple job, nothing more. The security guard at the gate looked him up and down with open suspicion, scanning the faded work boots, the plain gray shirt, the utility truck parked along the curb like it didn't quite belong in this polished world of stone pillars and manicured hedges. "Name?" the guard asked without moving aside. "Jack Miller," he replied calmly. "Contract repair. Fence damage on the east perimeter." The guard didn't respond immediately, only tapped something into a tablet with slow, deliberate indifference, like the idea of trust had to be earned twice in this neighborhood. Inside the property, beyond the tall hedges and glass reflections, Victoria Hayes stood on the second-floor balcony of her modern estate, her arms loosely folded as she watched the exchange below. At 35, she carried the kind of quiet authority that didn't need raising a voice. It lived in posture, in stillness, in the way people inside boardrooms stopped speaking when she entered. She didn't say anything at first, only observed the man at the gate the same way she observed acquisition reports and quarterly risks, carefully, distantly, as if measuring something not yet defined. The morning air was warm, around 78 degrees, and the scent of freshly cut grass drifted through the property, but Jack didn't seem to notice any of it. He just waited, not impatient, not defensive, just steady in a way that felt almost out of place here. The guard finally stepped aside, though reluctantly, and opened a narrow pedestrian access point rather than the main entrance, a subtle message that Jack understood immediately without needing it spoken aloud. He gave a slight nod, not in submission, but acknowledgement, and walked through with the same quiet pace he used when dropping his daughter off at school earlier that morning. Somewhere behind the reflective glass above, Victoria's gaze followed him as he crossed the driveway toward the damaged section of fencing near the garden line. There was no expression on her face that suggested approval or disapproval, only curiosity, faint and unspoken, like a question she hadn't decided to ask yet. Jack set his bag down beside the broken panel and knelt, running a hand along the wood grain, already assessing the repair before even opening his toolbox. He didn't look up at the house. He didn't look for attention. He simply began working, as if the world around him was secondary to the task in front of him. And high above, Victoria Hayes remained still, watching a man she had never met do something she wasn't used to seeing in her world of contracts and control, work without asking to be seen. Jack Miller continued working without interruption, the sound of his tools blending into the quiet morning atmosphere of the Hayes estate. The damaged fence section was worse than it first appeared, not dangerous, but clearly weakened from months of exposure to shifting weather and neglected maintenance. He adjusted his position on the grass, kneeling carefully to avoid damaging the landscaped edge, and began reinforcing the wooden structure with steady, practiced movements. Above him, Victoria Hayes stepped out onto the balcony fully now, no longer just observing from behind glass. She held a ceramic coffee cup in one hand, but she did not drink from it. Her attention remained fixed on the man below, as if something about his presence did not match the environment she had built her life around. Most contractors who entered her property arrived with urgency, excessive confidence, or an attempt to be noticed. Jack Miller carried none of that. He worked as if no one would ever evaluate him, and that absence of performance unsettled her more than she expected. The security guard remained near the side entrance, still watching Jack with cautious disapproval, but Victoria finally raised a subtle gesture with her free hand, signaling the guard to step back and give space. He hesitated for a brief moment before obeying, retreating toward the gatehouse. The estate grew quieter as a result, leaving only the faint sound of tools and distant birds moving through the tall oak trees. Victoria slowly descended the exterior staircase from the balcony, her steps measured and controlled, echoing lightly against the stone surface. She did not rush. She rarely did. When she reached the lower patio, She paused at a distance where she could see Jack clearly but not disturb his focus. For a moment, she said nothing. Jack sensed her presence but did not turn immediately. He finished securing one of the support brackets, checked its alignment with a small level from his pocket, and only then looked up. Their eyes met briefly. There was no surprise on his face, only acknowledgement. "Is the repair acceptable so far?" he asked calmly, as if speaking to a client at any other ordinary job site. Victoria studied him for a second longer before responding. "You did not ask for clarification when you saw the damage," she said instead of answering directly. Jack returned his attention to the fence, tightening another fastener. It was straightforward. The wood was worn but salvageable. It did not need much interpretation. Her gaze narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in curiosity. That was not the answer she typically received from contractors who preferred to inflate complexity for profit. "Most people would have reported it as a full replacement," she said. Jack paused briefly, then shrugged without dramatization. "Most people do not fix things if they can avoid it." The simplicity of the statement lingered in the air longer than expected. Victoria stepped a little closer, stopping just a few feet away from where he worked. From this distance, she could see the small details others might overlook. The worn edges of his tool bag, the careful organization of his equipment, the faint marks of a life shaped more by function than presentation. "You are not from a large company," she said. It was not a question. "No," Jack replied. "Independent contractor." Victoria nodded slightly, absorbing the information without judgment. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The estate around them remained still, as if waiting for direction that neither of them felt compelled to give. Finally, Jack stood, brushing a bit of dust from his hands, and checked the stability of the fence with a firm but gentle push. It held. He nodded once to himself, then began packing his tools with the same quiet discipline he had used since arriving. Victoria watched him, noticing that he moved without hesitation or wasted motion, as if every action had already been decided long before it happened. "You work like someone who has done this for a long time," she said at last. Jack closed his tool bag and looked toward her briefly. "Long enough to know when something just needs to be fixed instead of explained." That answer lingered between them as he lifted the bag and prepared to leave the work area. Victoria did not stop him. She simply watched as he began walking back toward the gate, the morning light casting a steady shadow behind him across the carefully maintained grounds. And for reasons she could not yet define, she remained standing there long after he had almost reached the exit. Jack Miller was already halfway down the driveway when he heard footsteps behind him, slow and deliberate against the stone path. He did not stop immediately. He adjusted the strap of his tool bag on his shoulder and continued walking for 2 more steps before finally pausing. When he turned, Victoria Hayes was standing at a comfortable distance, no longer above him in position or behind glass, but fully present in the same space. The morning light softened the edges of her expression, though her posture remained composed and controlled, as if even casual movement had to follow internal rules she never broke. "You completed the repair faster than expected," she said. Jack nodded once. It was a standard fix. Nothing complicated. Victoria studied him for a moment, then glanced back toward the fence line. The wooden panel looked stable now, aligned cleanly with the rest of the structure, as if it had never been damaged at all. "Most contractors I have worked with would have turned that into a multi-day project," she said. Jack gave a small shrug. "Most contractors are paid by time, not by solution." The answer landed quietly between them. There was no arrogance in his tone, only observation, as if he was describing something obvious that did not require agreement. Victoria tilted her head slightly, as if considering that perspective for the first time. "You do not operate like most people I hire," she said. Jack adjusted his grip on the tool bag. "I am not most people you hire." The simplicity of the statement carried more weight than intended, not as defiance, but as fact. A brief silence followed, filled only by the distant sound of wind moving through the trees and the faint hum of an irrigation system deeper within the property. Victoria finally stepped a little closer, reducing the distance between them by a few feet. "May I ask you something?" she said. Jack paused. "Depends on the question." That response almost made her smile, though it never fully formed. "Why did you not charge more for the work?" she asked. Jack looked at her for a moment, then glanced back at the fence he had just repaired. "Because it did not require more," he said. It was already fixed. Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly, not in challenge, but in curiosity. You could have used the opportunity to request additional compensation, she said. Jack shook his head. That would not have changed what needed to be done. The answer seemed to settle differently this time, deeper than before. Victoria looked away briefly toward the garden path, as if recalibrating something internal. Most conversations she had in her world involved negotiation, leverage, or expectation. This one did not. It simply existed without pressure. From a distance, the security guard watched the exchange but did not interrupt, uncertain whether his role even applied anymore. Victoria finally exhaled slowly, a controlled breath that suggested she was choosing her next words carefully. "Do you always work like this?" she asked. Jack shifted the weight of the tool bag slightly. "Like what?" "Without expectation," she said. Jack considered the question for a moment longer than before. "Expectation only slows things down," he replied. "If something is broken, you fix it. If it is not broken, you leave it alone." Victoria nodded once, absorbing the simplicity of his worldview. It was unfamiliar to her, not because she disagreed with it, but because it lacked the layers of interpretation she was used to navigating. A distant chime sounded from somewhere inside the estate, signaling a scheduled meeting or internal call, but she did not turn toward it immediately. Instead, her attention remained on the man standing a few feet away, already preparing to leave as if his presence had always been temporary by design. "You have a daughter," Victoria said suddenly, her tone shifting slightly as she recalled something she had overheard earlier. Jack stopped adjusting his grip on the bag. "Yes." "How old?" she asked. "9," he replied. Victoria nodded slowly, as if that detail added context to something she had not yet fully understood. "You mentioned her earlier," she said. Jack gave a faint nod. "She checks if I ate lunch. She thinks it is her job to make sure I do not forget." For the first time, Victoria's expression softened in a way that was not controlled or measured. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was there. "That is a serious responsibility for someone her age," she said quietly. Jack allowed a small, almost invisible smile. "She takes it seriously." Another silence followed, but this one felt different. Less observational, more human. Victoria looked back toward the repaired fence, then toward Jack. "Thank you," she said finally. The words were simple, but she did not often use them in situations like this. Jack nodded once. "You are welcome." He turned then, resuming his walk toward the gate. Victoria did not stop him. She remained standing in the same spot, watching as he moved farther away across the property, until the distance between them became just another quiet detail in a morning that no longer felt entirely ordinary. The afternoon had settled over the Hayes estate with a quiet stillness, the kind that made even distant sounds feel softened and deliberate. Jack Miller had already left the main property road and was walking along the sidewalk outside the gates when his phone vibrated inside his pocket. He paused, shifted his tool bag to his other shoulder, and answered without looking at the screen. "Hey, Dad," a small voice said immediately, bright but slightly tired. It was his daughter. Jack's expression changed in a subtle way, the firmness of his work posture easing into something warmer. "Hey, kiddo. Everything okay?" There was a brief rustle on the other end, the sound of movement, maybe a backpack being opened. "I finished my math worksheet early today," she said. "Mom said I could call you before dinner." Jack glanced at the time on his phone. It was just past 4:30 in the afternoon, and the Texas sun was still strong enough to cast long, warm reflections across the pavement. "That sounds like a good deal," he replied gently. "Did you eat lunch?" There was a short pause before she answered honestly. "I had half of a sandwich. I was not very hungry." Jack slowed his steps slightly, his voice softening. "You need to eat, even if you are busy thinking about other things." "I know," she said quietly. "Are you done with work?" Jack looked back toward the direction of the estate gates, now distant behind him. "Almost," he said. "Just one job today." "Was it a hard one?" she asked. Jack considered the question for a moment, then gave a simple answer. "Not hard. Just interesting." On the other side of the call, she giggled faintly. "Interesting is good, right?" "Sometimes," Jack said, allowing a small smile. "I will be home before sunset." "Promise?" she asked immediately. "Promise," he replied without hesitation. After the call ended, Jack stood still for a moment on the quiet suburban sidewalk, the tool bag resting against his leg. The world around him continued without interruption, cars passing at a steady pace, distant lawn equipment humming from another property, the soft rustle of wind moving through nearby trees. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and began walking again. Behind him, inside the Hayes estate, Victoria Hayes stood near the same repaired fence, though now she was no longer watching it. Instead, she held a printed report in her hand, something delivered by her assistant earlier that morning. It was a standard operational summary for property maintenance, vendor activity, and scheduled inspections. Her eyes scanned the lines quickly, but her attention kept drifting back to one detail she had underlined earlier without fully realizing why. Independent contractor, no corporate affiliation, completed repair under quoted estimate, no additional charges requested. She lowered the document slightly, her gaze moving toward the empty space where Jack had stood earlier. There was something unusual about how quickly the task had been completed, not because of speed alone, but because there had been no negotiation attached to it. No attempt to extend, no request for oversight, no effort to elevate the situation beyond what it was. Just execution, clean and unembellished. One of her estate managers approached cautiously from the side path, holding a tablet. "Miss Hayes, should I schedule him for additional perimeter inspections next week?" he asked. Victoria did not answer immediately. Her eyes remained on the fence line, as if replaying the morning in her mind. "What did you think of his work?" she asked instead. The manager hesitated. Efficient. Unusual. He did not attempt to upsell anything. He actually pointed out areas that did not need repair instead of suggesting they did. That detail seemed to land differently. Victoria finally turned her head slightly toward him. "And that is uncommon?" The manager nodded. "Very." She fell silent again, her attention drifting back to the now still garden path. The estate around her remained perfect in its symmetry, every detail maintained by design, every element placed with intention. Yet something about the simplicity of what had just occurred felt oddly out of place within it. Not disruptive, just different. She handed the report back to the manager. "Schedule him again," she said calmly. The manager nodded and stepped away. Victoria remained where she was, the afternoon light casting a soft reflection across the glass of the nearby windows. She did not move immediately. Instead, she stood quietly, as if listening for something that was no longer there, while somewhere beyond the gates, Jack Miller continued walking home under the steady Texas sun, unaware that a single morning repair had begun to linger in a place far beyond wood, nails, and fences. The next morning arrived with a quiet clarity over the suburban streets of Austin, Texas, as Jack Miller stood inside a small corner grocery store, waiting in line with a half-gallon of milk and a loaf of bread tucked under his arm. The fluorescent lights above him hummed softly, blending with the low sound of morning conversations and the beeping of checkout scanners. He looked tired in the way of someone who had already worked a full day before most people had even woken up. His phone rested in his pocket, silent for now, while his thoughts drifted briefly back to the previous day's job at the Hayes estate, though he did not dwell on it. For him, it had been another repair, another task completed, another home made a little more stable than before. Meanwhile, across town in a glass-walled office on the upper floors of Hayes Realty Group, Victoria Hayes stood beside a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city skyline. She held a tablet in one hand, but her attention was not fully on the financial report displayed on the screen. Instead, her mind kept returning to something far less structured than data or projections. The man from yesterday. She had already reviewed the maintenance logs twice that morning, something she rarely did for a minor contractor assignment. There was no logical reason for the repetition, yet she found herself noticing details she would normally ignore. No overtime request, no inflated invoice, no suggestion of unnecessary upgrades. Only completion. Efficient, precise, final. Her assistant entered the office quietly, holding a slim folder. "The contractor from yesterday has been marked for standard rotation scheduling," he said. Victoria did not turn around immediately. "Standard rotation?" she repeated. "Yes," the assistant confirmed. "He is listed as available for similar property repairs if needed." Victoria paused for a moment, then finally set the tablet down on the desk. "Adjust that," she said calmly. The assistant looked up slightly. "Adjust it how?" "Prioritize him," she replied. There was a brief silence in the room. It was subtle, but unusual enough to register. The assistant hesitated before nodding. Understood. When he left, the office returned to silence, but Victoria remained standing near the window. She was not used to making decisions without a clear operational reason attached to them. Yet the thought of Jack Miller being treated as interchangeable with any other contractor did not feel accurate to her anymore. Later that afternoon, Jack returned to his small home on the outskirts of the city. The house was modest, a single-story structure with a small yard and a slightly uneven driveway. Inside, the sound of a television played faintly from the living room where his daughter sat cross-legged on the couch, drawing in a notebook. When she saw him enter, her face brightened immediately. "Dad," she said, standing up quickly. Jack set the grocery bag on the kitchen counter and smiled. "Hey, kiddo." She ran over and hugged him without hesitation. He rested a hand gently on her head for a moment before stepping back. "Did you finish your schoolwork?" he asked. She nodded proudly. "And I colored 2 extra pages." Jack glanced at the notebook she held, noticing the careful detail in her drawings. "That looks good," he said. "You are getting better." She smiled, then tilted her head slightly. "Did the rich lady call you again?" Jack paused for a brief second while unpacking the groceries. "No," he said. "Why would she?" "I do not know," she replied casually. She seemed like she might. Jack gave a small, quiet laugh and shook his head. People like that do not usually call back for something small like a fence repair. But even as he said it, he did not sound entirely certain. Across the city, Victoria Hayes stood once again near the window of her office, now holding a different document. It was a schedule adjustment confirming Jack Miller had been reassigned for priority consideration on future property maintenance requests. She read the line once, then placed the document down. Outside, the city continued its steady movement. Cars crossing intersections, people moving between buildings, conversations forming and dissolving in seconds. Yet for reasons she did not fully understand, the name Jack Miller remained in her mind longer than any of it, not as a contractor, not as a service provider, but as something that had not yet been properly defined. The afternoon heat pressed down on the city of Austin as Jack Miller stood beneath the open hood of a broken-down pickup truck on the side of a quiet residential street. He had arrived only 20 minutes earlier after receiving a call from a neighbor who knew his number through a small local referral network. The issue was simple enough, a loose electrical connection that had caused the vehicle to stall without warning. Jack worked in steady silence, his hands moving with familiar precision as he tightened the connection and checked the battery output with a compact handheld meter. Nearby, the owner of the truck watched anxiously from the curb, but Jack remained focused, unaffected by the pressure of being observed. For him, mechanical problems always had the same truth. They either worked or they did not, and emotions rarely changed that outcome. Across the city, inside the glass office of Hayes Realty Group, Victoria Hayes stood in front of a conference table surrounded by senior executives reviewing quarterly performance reports. The room was bright, modern, and filled with quiet tension that came from numbers that determined entire divisions. Victoria listened without interruption, her expression controlled and unreadable as projections were presented on a large screen. Yet even as the meeting continued, her attention occasionally drifted to a different thought that had been interrupting her focus since the morning. Jack Miller. It was not logical. She had worked with thousands of contractors, vendors, consultants, and specialists over the years. Most of them blurred together after a single interaction. Yet this one did not fade. After the meeting ended, Victoria remained seated while the others filed out. Her assistant approached with a tablet. "Your afternoon schedule is clear," he said. However, the property management team flagged a new maintenance request for the West Corridor Estates. "Same contractor available if you approve." Victoria looked up slightly. "Which contractor?" she asked. The assistant checked the screen. "Jack Miller." There was a brief pause, subtle but noticeable. "Assign him," Victoria said calmly. The assistant nodded and left the room. Victoria leaned back slightly in her chair, her gaze fixed on nothing in particular as the city skyline stretched beyond the glass wall in front of her. She did not question the decision aloud, but internally she registered the pattern forming. It was the second time in 2 days his name had appeared without her initiating it. Later that evening, Jack finished the roadside repair and closed the hood of the truck. The owner thanked him repeatedly, offering payment that Jack politely reduced to only what was necessary for parts. He did not linger afterward. Instead, he returned to his own vehicle, wiping his hands with a small cloth before starting the engine. As he drove home, the sun was beginning to lower, casting long golden reflections across the asphalt. When he arrived, his daughter was waiting near the front door, holding a small drawing in her hands. She ran toward him as soon as he stepped out of the car. "Dad, I made something for you," she said excitedly. Jack smiled and knelt slightly to take the paper. It was a drawing of a small house, a fence, and two figures standing together under a bright sun. "This is good," he said softly. "Who are they?" "That is you and me," she replied. "And that is the fence you fixed." Jack studied the drawing for a moment longer, then nodded. "It looks stronger than the last one I fixed," he said. She laughed, and for a brief moment the weight of the day disappeared from his expression. Inside her high-rise office, Victoria Hayes stood alone once again, looking out over the illuminated city. On her desk sat the approved maintenance assignment bearing Jack Miller's name. She had not planned to think about him again that day, yet his presence remained in her thoughts with quiet persistence, not as a professional necessity, but as something far less defined and far more difficult to ignore. The following morning arrived with a different kind of silence over Austin, Texas, as Jack Miller stood inside a small hardware supply store comparing two identical sets of replacement brackets for a fence reinforcement job scheduled later that day. He held each item carefully, checking weight and alignment with quiet focus, as if small differences mattered more than appearance. Behind him, a radio played softly above the register, filling the store with distant music that blended into the low hum of everyday life. Jack eventually chose one set, placed it on the counter, and paid without conversation beyond a simple thank you. The clerk barely looked up. It was the kind of interaction Jack preferred. Efficient, minimal, and without unnecessary attention. Meanwhile, across town, inside the executive research division of Hayes Realty Group, Victoria Hayes sat alone in a private office reviewing a newly prepared background report on Jack Miller that she had not personally requested but had indirectly triggered through a routine vendor verification process. The document had arrived that morning, marked as standard due diligence, yet it had already consumed more of her attention than any comparable file in recent memory. She read slowly, her expression controlled but increasingly focused. According to the report, Jack Miller had previously worked in structural engineering consulting, specializing in residential and small infrastructure stabilization projects across multiple states, including Texas, Colorado, and Arizona. There were references to certified project oversight roles, safety compliance coordination, and a brief period connected to military engineering support work several years earlier, though the details were limited and partially redacted for privacy. Victoria leaned back slightly in her chair, letting the document rest on the desk as she processed the information. It did not change what she had already observed, but it added weight to it. The way he assessed structural damage instantly, the precision of his repairs, the absence of hesitation when making adjustments that others would have escalated or delayed. None of it was random. Her assistant entered quietly, noticing her focus. "You requested additional verification on contractor Miller," he said. Victoria did not immediately respond. Instead, she tapped the edge of the document lightly. "This is not standard for someone assigned to minor estate repairs," she said. The assistant hesitated. His profile was flagged due to previous licensing records and high-level project involvement. It appears he stepped away from larger contracts several years ago. Victoria looked up slightly. "Why?" The assistant shook his head. "No formal explanation recorded. It looks like he transitioned into independent work after a personal relocation and reduced scope of operations." Victoria remained silent for a moment, her gaze shifting toward the window where the city stretched outward in structured grids of glass and steel. People in her world rarely stepped down from larger roles unless something significant forced the change. Yet Jack Miller did not present as someone who had been diminished by circumstance. If anything, he appeared deliberate in his absence from complexity. Later that afternoon, Jack arrived at another residential property, this one a smaller home in a quiet neighborhood east of the city, where a loose structural support beam on a backyard pergola had been reported. He worked without delay, assessing load points and reinforcing the weakened joint with careful precision. A neighbor watched from a distance, but did not interrupt. Jack did not mind being observed when it was from afar. It was direct interaction he avoided unless necessary. As he finished the repair and tested the stability with a firm but controlled push, his phone vibrated in his pocket. He stepped aside, wiped his hands, and answered. It was his daughter again. "Dad?" she said immediately. "Are you busy today?" Jack looked at the completed structure in front of him. "Not anymore," he replied gently. "Why?" There was a small pause before she spoke again. "I just wanted to tell you I am proud of you." Jack paused, his expression softening in a way no professional environment ever saw. "That is good to hear," he said quietly. "I am proud of you too." After the call ended, Jack stood still for a moment before packing his tools. He did not know that at that exact same time, across the city skyline, Victoria Hayes was reading the last line of his background file again, realizing that the man who fixed fences with quiet hands had once been someone trusted with structures far more complex than anything in her world, and that understanding changed nothing and everything at the same time. The late afternoon sun cast a warm golden tone over Austin as Jack Miller stepped out of a small neighborhood hardware store carrying a sealed box of replacement components for his next repair job. The air was still, with only the faint sound of distant traffic moving along the main road. Jack adjusted the box under his arm and checked the address on his phone one more time before heading toward his truck. His day had been long but familiar, a steady rhythm of small fixes, short conversations, and quiet returns home. He did not notice the black vehicle that had been parked across the street for several minutes. Its engine off, but its presence intentional. Inside that vehicle, Victoria Hayes sat in the back seat, not as a CEO in a boardroom, but as an observer outside her usual environment. She had not planned to be here. In fact, she had left her office earlier than scheduled, instructing her assistant to postpone her remaining meetings without explanation. Something about Jack Miller had moved from professional curiosity to personal attention, and she was no longer fully satisfied with reading reports or receiving summaries. She wanted to see with her own eyes. When Jack reached his truck and placed the box in the back, Victoria finally stepped out of the vehicle. The sound of the door closing behind her was soft, but noticeable in the quiet street. Jack turned at the sound and paused when he saw her approaching. There was no security team, no formal introduction, no corporate distance. Just Victoria Hayes walking across the pavement in a simple but well-structured outfit that still carried an unmistakable sense of authority. Jack closed the truck bed slowly. "This is unexpected," he said calmly. Victoria stopped a few feet away, maintaining a respectful distance. "I was in the area," she said, though her tone made it clear that was not the full reason. Jack nodded slightly, not pressing further. He was not surprised by many things in life, but he also did not assume people owed him explanations. Victoria glanced at the box in his hands. "Another repair?" she asked. "Different property," Jack replied. "Smaller issue this time." She observed him for a moment, then shifted her gaze toward the quiet residential street around them. "I reviewed your background," she said finally. There was no accusation in her voice, only acknowledgement. Jack did not react immediately. He simply rested one hand on the edge of the truck bed. "That was not necessary," he said. Victoria nodded once. "Probably not. But it explained something I could not ignore." Jack looked at her, waiting but not asking. Victoria continued. "You did not always do small independent work. You were involved in structural engineering at a larger scale." Jack remained quiet. There was no discomfort in his expression, only a steady acceptance that his past was no longer hidden. "That was a long time ago," he said. Victoria studied him carefully. "Why leave it behind?" Jack exhaled slowly, glancing briefly at the street ahead before answering. "Sometimes scale does not matter if the work takes you away from what matters most." The answer hung between them, simple but difficult to misinterpret. Victoria shifted slightly, as if adjusting her understanding of him in real time. "Your daughter?" she asked. Jack nodded. "Yes." A brief silence followed. A passing car moved slowly down the street, its tires brushing against the asphalt before fading into the distance. Victoria looked down for a moment, then back at him. "You prioritize her over everything else," she said, not as a question, but as observation. "Yes," Jack replied without hesitation. Victoria's expression softened slightly, though she maintained her composure. "That is not something most people in my world would understand easily," she said. Jack gave a faint, almost imperceptible smile. Most people do not have to. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was no longer strictly professional, but it was not familiar either. It existed somewhere in between, undefined but present. Victoria finally stepped back slightly, as if deciding not to extend the conversation further. "Thank you for your honesty," she said. Jack nodded once. It was not a complicated answer. Victoria turned slightly toward her vehicle, but paused before fully walking away. "If I request your services again," she said, "it will not be treated as a standard assignment." Jack looked at her calmly. "It already is not," he replied. That answer caused her to pause briefly, but she did not respond immediately. Instead, she gave a small nod and returned to her car. As the door closed and the engine started, Jack remained by his truck for a moment longer, watching as the vehicle pulled away down the street. Inside the car, Victoria sat quietly, her attention not on the road ahead, but on the conversation she had just left behind. Realizing that what she was beginning to understand about Jack Miller was not something that fit easily into any report she had ever read. The following morning arrived with a pale, steady light stretching across Austin as Jack Miller stood inside his small kitchen, quietly pouring a cup of coffee into a worn ceramic mug. The house was still, except for the faint ticking of a clock on the wall and the soft sound of his daughter moving around in her room preparing for school. Jack leaned against the counter for a moment, taking a slow sip, his thoughts calm but present. Yesterday's conversation with Victoria Hayes lingered in the background of his mind, not as something urgent, but as something unfamiliar that did not yet have a place in his usual routine. He did not overanalyze it. That was not his way. He finished his coffee, rinsed the mug, and prepared to leave for work. Meanwhile, across the city in a high-rise office filled with glass reflections and quiet authority, Victoria Hayes stood before a long conference table as her executive team reviewed acquisition projections for a new residential development zone. The room was structured, precise, and filled with controlled energy, yet Victoria's focus occasionally drifted away from the presentation slides. Her assistant stood nearby, holding a tablet, waiting for instruction. When the meeting paused briefly, Victoria spoke without looking away from the data on the screen. "Has Jack Miller been scheduled for the West District inspection this week?" she asked. The assistant checked immediately. "Yes, that was confirmed yesterday. Standard assignment routing." Victoria paused for a moment. "Change it," she said. The room grew slightly quieter, though no one questioned her directly. "Change it how?" the assistant asked carefully. Victoria turned her attention toward him. "Make it priority direct assignment. I want him on the estate infrastructure review instead." The assistant hesitated. "That is a higher tier responsibility than his current contract level." Victoria's expression remained steady. "Then adjust the contract level," she said calmly. There was a brief silence before the assistant nodded and stepped away to process the request. The executives exchanged subtle glances but continued the meeting without interruption. Victoria remained composed, but her decision was no longer purely operational. It was intentional in a way she did not fully explain, even to herself. Later that afternoon, Jack arrived at a larger property than usual, a privately owned estate located on the outskirts of the city with multiple structures, long driveways, and extensive infrastructure systems connecting water, lighting, and security features. He parked his truck near a service entrance and stepped out, adjusting his tool belt before reviewing the assignment details on his phone. This was not a simple fence repair. It involved inspection and stabilization of several structural elements across the property. As he moved toward the main area, a staff coordinator met him at the entrance and guided him through the grounds. The scale of the estate was noticeably larger than the jobs he typically accepted, but Jack did not comment on it. He simply observed and followed instructions. As he worked through the first section of inspection, checking alignment on a supporting structure near a stone walkway, a familiar voice interrupted the quiet focus of his task. "You were assigned here directly." Jack turned slightly. Victoria Hayes stood several feet away, dressed in a more neutral professional outfit than before, her presence blending into the environment of the estate without diminishing its authority. Jack straightened slowly. "This is not a standard assignment," he said. Victoria nodded once. "I made the adjustment." Jack looked back toward the structure he was examining. "That was not necessary," he said. Victoria stepped closer but maintained a respectful distance. You are correct, she replied. It was not necessary. It was intentional. Jack did not respond immediately. He tightened one of the fittings on the structure, testing its stability before speaking. Intentional usually means there is an expectation attached, he said. Victoria considered that carefully. Not in this case, she said. Jack glanced at her briefly. Then what is the reason? He asked. Victoria hesitated for the first time, not from uncertainty in decision-making, but from the absence of a simple explanation. Because I trust your judgment more than the reports I am given, she said finally. Jack paused, then returned his attention to the structure. Reports are only as accurate as the people writing them, he replied. Victoria observed him for a moment, noticing again the same consistency she had seen from the beginning. No exaggeration, no performance, only direct engagement with the task in front of him. A short silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, but unresolved. You do not seem surprised by this level of responsibility, she said. Jack tightened another section and checked alignment before answering. Responsibility does not change the work, he said. It only changes how carefully people are watching it. Victoria absorbed that in silence. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The estate around them remained still, the sound of distant water flowing through irrigation channels filling the space between words. Victoria finally looked toward the structure Jack was finishing and then back to him. I would like you to continue on future projects directly assigned to me, she said. Jack did not immediately respond. He stepped back from the structure, inspecting it one final time before speaking. I do not usually work under direct assignment from executives, he said calmly. Victoria met his gaze. Then consider this an exception, she replied. Jack studied her briefly, then gave a small, measured nod. Exceptions change expectations, he said. Victoria did not disagree. Instead, she simply watched as Jack returned to his work, continuing the inspection with the same steady focus as before, while she remained standing nearby, realizing that the distance between their worlds was no longer as fixed as it had been when this first began. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more stories of courage, kindness, and second chances, because the people the world overlooks often leave the greatest impact.